Its wonderful texture revealed by the gentle touch of my fingers was exactly what I needed when I pulled out a hidden tool when accessing the back door of the open-air residence and taught a lesson to someone who fell asleep prematurely. Queen of no secrets. My name is Emily. I am 24 years old and I have always been one of those women who effortlessly catches the eye. I am tall, 5 feet 7 inches, with legs that are well defined from the time I dedicated to basketball in my youth, a delicate waist and hips that any tight dress strives to highlight. My skin has that golden tone of someone who grew up under the Texas sun, and my long brown hair is an inheritance from my mother. But make no mistake, I have never been the type to think too highly of myself. I have always kept my feet on the ground, especially because I grew up in a small town in the interior of Ohio, where everyone knows each other and any news becomes a topic of conversation at the convenience store on the corner. My mother unfortunately left us early, and I was raised by my father and my aunt. But when she got married and moved away, it was just me, my father and the farm workers. He was always a serious man, strict at work, but affectionate with me in a way that few daughters are blessed to experience. He was the typical farmer with calloused hands, an earthy aroma and a striking presence. When I grew up and went to the city to study, he stayed there to manage the farm, and we saw each other less and less. Life went on and I got married. It wasn't the dream wedding that everyone imagines. My husband was a good man, diligent, but predictable, the kind of person who does everything right but doesn't make your heart race. Over time, I began to feel that something was missing, an emptiness inside me that not all the love in the world could fill. Then my cousin's wedding came around and I knew that my Michael would be there. After more than a year without seeing him, the idea of seeing him again filled me with joy. I missed his imposing presence immensely, the way he made any place feel safe. The event was magnificent, filled with lights, live music and plenty of food. Michael arrived at night, straight from the farm, and when I saw him, something inside me trembled. He was wearing a dark gray suit that made him look more majestic than I remembered. His silver hair on the sides only reinforced the mature charm he always had, and his eyes, those dark, intense eyes watching me as if I was still his little girl, left me not knowing how to react. We went to a table away from the hustle and bustle, where we talked, laughed and drank a little. My husband, who has never been good with alcohol, decided to try the whiskey. A bad choice. 2 shots later, his face was already red, and another hour passed until he started complaining of dizziness. I sighed. I think you should get some rest. He insisted he was fine, but I already knew how this would end. I led him to the room we had reserved and, as soon as his head hit the pillow, he fell fast asleep. I left a glass of water next to the bed and stayed there watching him for a moment. The party was still going on outside, the music reaching muffled into the room. I wasn't tired and, for some reason, I didn't want to be alone. I went back to the party and there he was, sitting at the same table, now accompanied by a woman I didn't know. Dark-haired, elegantly dressed and with a smile that made her intentions clear. That bothered me. I don't know why, but I approached him and, as soon as he saw me, his smile widened. I thought I was going to spend the night taking care of your husband, he said playfully. He passed out. I thought it would be a waste to leave such a good party, I replied, smiling sideways. The woman who was there noticed the exchange of glances between us and, without saying anything, got up and left. Michael just laughed, holding the glass of whiskey and swirling the amber liquid. Before taking another sip, he asked, "So, do you want to dance?" He was never the dancing type, but there he was inviting me, and I, without hesitation, accepted. We went to the dance floor, where the DJ had already changed the upbeat songs for a softer rhythm. He held my hand and pulled me closer, a firm hand on my waist, guiding my steps. His perfume was a mix of woody aroma with the freshness of the night, and for a moment I found myself closing my eyes, just feeling that moment. When I opened my eyes, he was staring at me in a way I couldn't decipher. There, in the middle of the dance floor, my heart beat differently. Michael's hands were close to the curves of my waist, firm but at the same time gentle. His touch wasn't invasive, but it brought an unusual warmth, a kind of comfort I hadn't known I was missing until that moment. My body, almost involuntarily, followed his movements, and it was impossible to ignore how it fit so naturally. With each slow step, the thin fabric of my dress rippled, and I could feel some fingers sliding lightly. I didn't want to think too much, I just let myself go. He smiled at the corner of his mouth, leaning his face a little closer to my ear. "You dance much better than I expected." The heat of his breath sent a shiver down my spine. "I learned from you, remember?" I murmured, feeling a strange nervousness take over me. He laughed, and that deep, husky sound affected me somehow. My mind was more alert than ever. I felt his fingertips move lightly on my back. There was no longer any obstacle between the fabrics. The contacts were very close, and I was happy to notice the volume. A small slip, a tiny movement, and my breasts pressed gently against his chest. I should have stepped back, maybe even made a joke to break the mood, but I did nothing. His gaze met mine for a few seconds, and in that moment I felt a mix of feelings. For some inexplicable reason, I didn't want that moment to end. The music faded as our breathing grew closer, as if we had walked a mile on a hot day. He cleared his throat, pulling away a little, but without breaking the contact completely. "You've grown up," he commented in the same hoarse voice, as if he had realized something at that moment. I swallowed hard. Time flies, doesn't it? After a few more minutes of being close to that dance, I needed a break to breathe. I went outside the farmhouse where the party was still going on, but a little further away from the noise. The warm night wind caressed my skin, and the high moon illuminated the yard with a pale light. I closed my eyes for a moment. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. He approached slowly, without rushing, just stopped next to me, contemplating the sky for a moment before looking away at me. "You," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. I smiled awkwardly, in a different way. He took a deep breath, as if choosing his words carefully before continuing. "I don't know." He hesitated for a moment, but then his gaze met mine again. "I don't think I've ever stopped to realize who you really are." At a certain point, the distance that existed between us disappeared. The heat from his body radiated against my skin, and when his hand found my face, tracing a delicate line with his fingers, my breath caught. I could describe a kiss that was not rushed or hasty. I felt that my breasts were tense, feeling a certain chill from the light breeze that hung in the air. It was actually my body reacting to the heat of the moment. It was as if I were a ramp or perched on a log over a calm lake. At first, I was hesitant, feeling the texture, as if there was the heat of a sun on my skin. But little by little I found myself surrendering, sinking into the reflection of the water, being carried by the tide as time passed. I looked around to see if someone would arrive to interrupt something new that I no longer wanted to stop. I could feel the volume of the forgotten tool, as if it were on its side. My joy only increased, as if I was starting a new task without worrying about anything. Michael's hands gently descended the curve of my back, and my breasts were increasingly ready to be touched. I kept thinking about some things, but at the same time, we both wanted to accomplish that task, and so there was no problem with that. It was a wave that pulled me into a warm and welcoming ocean, a silent invitation to dive in with my eyes closed, and I dived in. Each movement was a silent dance, synchronized like the wind moving the branches of the trees before a summer rain. He lifted me easily, and our bodies fit together as if nature had molded us for that. Time lost its meaning. There was no more party, no music, no conversations in the background. There was only a woman on a rigid wooden trunk under the full moon and the starry sky, discovering a new universe in the silence of the night. And when everything finally calmed down, when the world turned back to its normal rhythm, I realized that nothing would ever be the same again. I was already tired and allowed him to finish with his tool as best he could, while I remained seated outside. And oddly enough, all the guests at the party remained quiet inside the house. Some who had left went through the front door. This access we had to the open air could only be discovered if someone went through the back door.